Do you know about the history of Christianity towards sexual and gender minorities, or would you like to know more? Today, I'm interviewing Reverend Dr. Charles Fensham. Charles is a professor of systematic theology at Knox College at the University of Toronto and an ordained minister of the Presbyterian Church of Canada. He is passionate about changing the hearts and minds of religious people towards the loving embrace of LGBTQI2+ people. His research interest is in the church and its mission in the contemporary context. Charles' academic work is focused on social change, public witness, theology, and ecology, and on the affirmation of sexual and gender minorities in Christian churches. He has recently published an amazing book entitled Misguided Love, Christians and the Rupture of LGBTQ2+ People, which describes the shocking history of Christian cruelty to sexual and gender minorities, the origins of this history of Christian hatred, and a sustained biblical and ethical argument for a change of heart in the Christian community towards sexual and gender minority people. Charles, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Brent, and I'm so happy to be with you and to talk about this important topic.
Wonderful, wonderful. So, Charles, can you tell us a bit about what it was like realizing that you were gay, and how was it like coming out for you?
So I guess my story starts with a suicide. I had a very good friend. I was born in South Africa and raised there, went to university there and so on. And as a young Presbyterian pastor, I had this friend who was a Roman Catholic, and he studied philosophy, ended up doing a doctorate on Spinoza. And we had lots of wonderful, deep conversations. Eventually, it became clear that he was gay. And one day, after some years teaching at the Catholic seminary in Pretoria, South Africa, he committed suicide. He jumped off a high-rise building. He could not bring together his Catholic faith and his gay sexual orientation, and the tension, the inner tension that he felt within himself between those two things. And it really set me thinking about sexuality, sexual orientation. And eventually I figured out I am gay. Now, it may sound strange, but my story is perhaps not so uncommon for people in my age range, growing up in a world where homophobia was assumed and positively assessed, where it was not even, for somebody with a religious vocation in my world, that it wasn't even a possibility to think of being gay. And at that point, I was already married. So for me to come to terms with that in my own heart and mind was a really interesting, challenging journey, and full of self-hatred, full of internalized homophobia, as I learned later on, and also full of a sense of failure in my marriage, and questions about the vows that I took and what that meant. Mm-hmm. So I struggled and tried to live out my life within this mixed orientation marriage, trying to be kind and fair to my wife. And this carried on for many years. And many years later, here in Canada, it was actually my wife that made the call. We had not spoken about this at all. I internalized it for many, many years. But she came to the conclusion that our marriage had to end. And we had an amicable separation. And it ended up that we came out to each other, because she turned out to be lesbian and I'm gay. So this is in a nutshell the story, but of course there's much more to it, because at that point I was already a professor of theology at Knox College, which is a Presbyterian seminary, and it was a non-affirming denomination. And so then the next series of troubles arose. And my book is really a result of all that journey.
And do you cover some of this in your book too?
Not in detail, because it's not, first of all, a biographical story, but I do mention it at the beginning of the book. And in a sense, the book is my answer to my own struggle.
Wow. Wow. Thank you. Thank you. So you say that your struggle inspired you to write the book, but why now?
Part of it was, of course, having done a lot of reading and research to try and figure out who I am as a human being before God, as a theologian, as somebody who's now suddenly divorced, and figuring out what that meant, and being in a non-affirming denomination, and what do I do with that? And so my book was, as the denomination started a conversation about changing its policy, my book was partly motivated, or strongly motivated, by an attempt to address the things I hear around me, things people are saying, and the things that I knew that people didn't know.
Yeah.
So that was core for me. It seemed to me there was a lot known, or to be known, a lot out there in historical reality, and in history, in studies, in theological reflection, in biblical thinking, but people were largely ignorant within my denominational context. And I was hoping that these things that I have learned and discovered could be brought together in one book to try and address those kinds of things.
I think the timing is amazing, Charles, because over the years as a pastor, many times I would talk to people about how I didn't believe that some of the traditional scriptures were interpreted correctly or necessarily applied today, et cetera. And people would often ask, well, how did this happen? How did the church get to be so anti-gay? What's going on? And I really couldn't answer the question until your book. And so thank you. So where do you think the Christian church has gone wrong?
I think fundamentally, the Christian church has gone wrong by harming people, harming people who are sexual and gender minorities, the whole spectrum of experience that we know today through science and through people sharing their experience and so on. All these different categories that we now talk about, lesbian, gay, and so on, and the gender categories, and people who are worried about gender binaries and gender experience. So all these things together, people like this, and people who found themselves to be like this through Christian history suffered tremendously. They were killed, they were tortured, they were psychologically harmed, they were cast out of communities. They were separated from their families. The stories are severe, serious, and a fundamental denial of the teaching of Jesus Christ. The teaching of love, the law of love that Jesus elevated to the biggest law, is consistently ignored, and it keeps being consistently ignored in many different contexts. There are churches who have become more affirming and so on, and it's wonderful. It's happening all around the world, but still, largely, it's amazing how many people do not believe that the heart of the story of Jesus and his message is love.
Yeah. Down through the years, I've had my moments of confrontation with the religious right, and it's often shocking to me how often I would get a note, or someone would make a comment, like, "You deserve to die," and the letter would be signed in Jesus' name, right? Or "You deserve to be killed," or the vial that would come out in the name of religion.
Yeah.
So what are some of the main points you'd like people to take away from your book?
I think this idea of love. So the book is divided in three parts. The first part is kind of an exploration of theology, Bible, and the reasons for all this animosity and anger and hatred directed at LGBTQI people. So there's a first section that deals with those things. And in that section, I want people to understand, and especially our listeners, I want them to understand, listeners who are LGBTQI, that the Bible does not teach that you are a sinner because you are LGBTQI, or that if you are in a relationship that is same-sex or disliked by your community, that the Bible and Christian teaching is against that. It's simply not true, and you should not allow those things to affect you negatively, even as I know that it affected me negatively, even though I knew with my mind that it's probably not true. I still knew, I felt in my heart, I felt that shame, I felt that struggle, and in fact, I ended up on the verge of suicide myself, and had to get clinical intervention at one point in that particular struggle. So I want people to hear that. I want you, the hearer, to hear that God loves you, and that there is a loving community available to you, and that you need to know that. Even if you feel isolated, reach out, because there are people who will affirm you and welcome you. You know, one of the key things that I think one of the most harmful things that Christian churches in North America do today, more conservative Christian churches who are non-affirming, is they have this message that they call welcoming but not affirming. This is a really, really dangerous idea. Psychologists call it a double bind, where you tell somebody, I love you, but I hate you.
Yeah.
It's like saying two opposing things at the same time to someone. And it's now been very thoroughly researched, this idea of what they call the double bind. It's been thoroughly researched, and its impact is tremendous. You know, we can talk about all the research on the harm that's being done by Christian churches and how it's impacting people today, right here in Canada, right here in our city in Toronto, religious schools, religious attitudes in schools that bring children at risk of suicide, young people, youth at risk of suicide, of all kinds of forms of substance abuse, and other risk factors that have been now thoroughly researched, and I outline in my book. There's so much risk going on, and so much hatred still being projected, that I want people to hear that this is not the message of Christianity and of Jesus Christ himself.
Yeah. Yeah, religion has such power to impact, and it can be for good or not, right? And it can be used for good or not. And yes, I think the message in your book is crucially important because of that power.
Yeah. So I mean, one of the questions, Brent, that one of the things I use in my book is Stephen Fry's series of documentaries called Out There, where he says, why is this going on? He goes around the world and he's asking people, why do you hate us so much? And I think that question needs to be answered. And I try to answer that in my book by looking at different theories that, you know, probably is too complicated to go into in this kind of conversation. But there are some actually interesting reasons that why there is so much anger and hatred. And it is not because we are who we are.
Yeah. I often say to people, my homosexuality is not the problem, your homophobia is, right? Homosexuality has never divided a family or anything. Homophobia has divided, right? And caused the problem. And one of the things about Rainbow Faith and Freedom, the organization that I'm involved in and that you've been really helpful with, is that we hear from activists all over the world that religious-based discrimination is the issue, right?
Yeah.
And so changing that, instead of just fighting it and seeing religion as the enemy, to be really honing in on religious-based discrimination, religious-based hatred in fact, is the problem. You said there were 3 parts of the book, and I want you to make sure if you wanted to make it, any comments on part 2 or part 3, or were you okay with that being the main point?
No, I think it's important for people to know what those other parts are. So the second part, which is the central part of the book, is about the history of harm and hatred in Christian tradition. So I'm looking specifically at Christianity, asking the question why and how. And I find, my own denomination this year, hallelujah, has approved marriage equality as well as the ordination of LGBTQI people for the first time. It's now official teaching of the church that this is allowed. We have much work to do, but that happened. But I happened to speak to the leader of our denomination, who's called the moderator in the Presbyterian Church for this year, who comes from quite a conservative evangelical Christian background. And he called me a few weeks before the General Assembly meeting where these decisions were made. And he told me that he had read my book. And reading the history, he said he cried and cried and cried. He said his heart was broken, realizing that he did not know this history, that he did not know how it still impacts people, and that it opened his eyes. So for me, this section of the book is really important because I think we need to bear witness to the suffering, to the pain, and to hatred that is hidden behind Christian ideas, wrongly hidden. So I look at all kinds of historical pieces, including the role of Stoicism and the Roman Empire and toxic manliness in the formation of these homophobic ideas that became so influential in Western culture in general and got exported by colonialism to all kinds of different colonies around the world. So, many countries in Africa, for instance, there was no negativity towards homosexuality until the colonialists and the missionaries arrived and it became law. So in the British Empire, for instance, those laws were exported and they are still in force in many of those countries when it's been abolished in the origin country. Mm-hmm. So those are things that we need to look at. And of course, then there's so much to discover in the history, including the extermination of so many LGBTQI people during the Second World War in Hitler's concentration camps, and the re-imprisonment of the survivors after the war. So they weren't set free. They were kept in prison because of this hatred, not because they were criminals, but because they were hated by society. And the churches were quiet. They didn't say a word. And in the last section, I'm trying to say, what do we do with this as Christians? How do we change? What's the history of the 20th century and 21st century in moving towards welcoming, affirming, loving one another as we are called to do.
So are there any other things that you think the Christian church should be doing, needs to be doing today?
In a sense, it's very simple. We should return to the gospel of Jesus Christ, which says, love God and love one another. Listen to one another and treat each other as human beings. If we are just human, I often say to my friends who are heterosexual and who have trouble understanding same-sex relationships, imagine your beloved, and imagine somebody telling you you're not allowed to love your beloved. You're not allowed to be with that person. You're not allowed to cherish them in body and soul and mind. That's what's being done to same people in same-sex relationships. The love is just, it's just the same. It's just as beautiful. It's just as wonderful. In fact, it's fantastic. It's not better than heterosexual love, but it's also not really different.
So I know that the book focuses particularly on the Christian part of faith. Have you come across anything around other world religions? I know most have exactly the same problem. Some have exactly the same history. But in terms of your research, is there any information about their history or any advice that you have around other faith traditions?
Yeah, so the editor of my book was a Jewish rabbi. He's a professor at Harvard Medical School, and he kept pushing me. He said, "You need to write for the Jews as well," and I kept pushing back, saying, I don't feel qualified as a Christian to speak about somebody else's religion, and at least, I can say I don't like what you're doing, and I don't agree with what you're doing. But knowing about where it comes from and how it works within your religious world would be very presumptuous of me. But of course, Christianity and Judaism share a very long history. And Jewish texts have often been blamed for the hatred of LGBTQI people, particularly Leviticus, "A man shall not lie with a man as with a woman," which, by the way, is a mistranslation of the text. And so I discovered that Jewish rabbis have actually done a lot of work on this, including Jacob Milgram, who's a conservative Jewish rabbi, wrote a very interesting commentary on the book of Leviticus, in which he points out that Christians misread the text completely. They just don't understand the Jewish context. They don't understand who's reading, who's being addressed. They don't understand the actual classical Hebrew correctly. And he points out that it had to do with the responsibility of a husband to his wife, not about same-sex relationships. There's two texts in Leviticus, and that it had to do with the right to bear children for a woman. So if you say a man shall not lie with a man, it's about not wasting your sexual energy on another man when your wife deserves to receive it. Is at the heart of the argument. And so, it's interesting when you start discovering that people then universalize this text and make it into a homophobic text, when it really is actually about a particular historical understanding of how people have a responsibility to one another in a marriage relationship in a specific culture, which is very patriarchal at the time. And had to do with, bearing children is the most important thing a woman could do. So it's all those kinds of misunderstandings. So I've learned a lot about that, and also that in Judaism, actually, there are forms of conservative Judaism where homophobia is a big problem, but there are many conservative Jews who don't have a problem. And so it's interesting to discover that. I've learned about medieval history in Islam, where Islam was actually much more advanced than Christianity in trying to find what they thought medical reasons for same-sex sexual attraction. And they would be more, I guess you could say, quote, liberal about how they understand what's going on, kind of compassionate. So they saw this as a bad thing, but they compassionately tried to understand it. So, in Islam, there's also, there are, of course, same-sex relational histories in Islam, as there is in Christianity, and I write about that a little bit too in my book. There's some really wonderful Christians in Christian history who were gay or lesbian. Those histories have been suppressed, but they were certainly there.
Well, I do hope that people in other religious traditions kind of can see the tremendous value that your book is being received by in traditional Christianity, and that they might, take a look at doing the same thing in their traditions, because, in addition to lots of LGBT people who are Christian and were struggling, who will be helped by your book, I think ultimately we need to provide those same kind of resources for people who are in other traditions as well.
Yeah, and a lot depends on, how that tradition understands how its religious truth works. So, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam share a text-based a book-based sort of understanding of how this works. But other religions have other stories and other ways of dealing with it, and they have more flexibility, actually, Buddhism, Hinduism, and so on. A lot of the homophobia in those religious contexts don't really come from the religion directly, but through the colonial influences on that religion over time. Yeah. So I think you can't underestimate the way that the very deep Western culture homophobia spread through the world by law, by means of laws, as well as attitude and education, and impacted on those worlds.
Charles, I've often said that a religious attack requires a religious response, and I really want to thank you for playing a significant role in that response. And I think that your book is helping lots of individuals in terms of their own journey, but it's also really challenging institutions, denominations, et cetera, within the Christian tradition to really take a look at what they're doing. So you've done a tremendous service to the movement and to the future and to individuals. And I want to thank you for taking the pain and the anguish of your friend dying and of your own struggle and your own denomination struggle and turning that around into something that can be extremely helpful. And I would encourage our listeners to buy your book. There are going to be links below this where people can go to do that. And again, Charles, thank you for your perseverance, your witness, and thank you for this book.
And thank you, Brent, because we didn't talk about this, but you meant a lot to me in my own coming out journey. So thank you.
If you found this interview helpful, please consider subscribing to this channel. It's free to subscribe and really helps the channel a great deal. And don't forget to check out Charles, the link to Charles' book down below, and recommend it to your friends as well. Thank you.